Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Community from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the fourth episode of our summer series, where today I'm delighted to talk with historian Andrew Preston about his new book, Total Defense, The New Deal and the Invention of National Security.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Andrew Preston is a professor of American history based at Clare College, Cambridge, where he focuses on the ideas and concepts that shape America's behavior in the world at both the elite and popular levels. He will shortly take up the Lyons Brown Jr. Distinguished Professor in Diplomacy and Statecraft at the University of Virginia. Andrew won the 2013 Charles Taylor Prize for his book, Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, Religion in American War and Diplomacy. Find a link to his new book, Total Defense, in our show notes. Let's listen into the conversation. All right, welcome back, folks, to this episode of Diplomatic Community, and we are doing another summer bonus episode where we talk about a recently released book. And this week, we are talking to Andrew Preston, a colleague of mine in the diplomatic history field, and he's written a new book called Total Defense, The New Deal and the Invention of National Security. Andrew, thanks, and welcome to Diplomatic Community.
Thanks for having me on, Kelly. Always a pleasure.
So I'm just going to dive right into it. And I read the book. I thought it was great. And you make some very fascinating
And a podcast. Great book.
Yeah,
that's it.
And the
Show's over.
podcast. It's a fascinating new line of argumentation that we'll get into. But when I'm reading it, and I always think about this when I'm asking people stuff about the books they wrote. So where did the idea for this book come from? Like, were you doing some research on something and like a light bulb went off and you're like, that looks interesting, or there was a connection there that I didn't think of? So, where did this originate?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. Yeah, if there's an origin point or an origin story, it's when I was doing, it's a long time ago. It was when I was doing my PhD. And I researched my PhD, which became my first book. It was on the bureaucratic origins of the Vietnam War. I looked at McGeorge Bundy, who was the first national security advisor as we know them today. He was the first person to give that post actual power. And I looked at Bundy and the NSC staff and their interactions with the Pentagon and the CIA and the State Department and the White House. And I noticed that really, this is the David Halberstam best and the brightest irony, right? I noticed these incredibly smart people, Bundy and Johnson and Kennedy and McNamara and others, Rusk, were making all sorts of cases for war or for intervention. But one of them that they kept coming back to was that this is a war of self-defense or intervention for self-defense, even before it was an actual American war. We need to do this not because it's necessarily in the national interest, not because we're upholding, our good faith with allies, or maybe there are economic concerns, although I myself don't put a whole lot of weight in that, but some scholars do. So you have a whole range of factors. But one of them that they kept coming back to was, we need to defeat communism in Vietnam, or at least stop it from spreading to South Vietnam, because if we don't, then we're going to be at risk at home. That if we don't stop them in Saigon, then the next thing you know, they're going to be in San Francisco or LA. And that just struck me as a kind of nonsensical argument. But these really clever people made it sincerely. And what struck me is that they made it sincerely, not just in a political speech like Johnson did all the time. If we don't stop them in Saigon, then we're going to have to face them down in Honolulu or San Francisco. Okay, that's political rhetoric, which is important, but you can sort of say he's just saying that to make a case in public. But they were saying this stuff in top secret memos and in private conversations, like on the tapes, the Johnson tapes that we can listen to now. And so that's when it first started puzzling me. I thought, why did they think that? How did they think that? And then I kind of put the idea to one side. And then, you know what, I'm going to be honest. I don't know why I came back to it. Maybe about 10 years ago, I started thinking about it again. I started writing a little bit about it. And I wanted to put them in their proper historical context. And then I started reading some literature. I'm not the first to say that national security is invented in the 30s and 40s. There is a literature on that already. I do make a contribution to that literature by making some original arguments. But then when I started reading that literature, that I started thinking, wow, national security has a history. It's not something that goes back to the founding of the country. And it's not something that goes back to early, to Hobbes or to Thucydides or Machiavelli or whoever. It's something that actually has a history. And I wanted to trace that history.
And to get to the point where you got in the 1930s to talk about the creation of national security, to understand that broader sea change in how Americans framed and thought about security in the late 1930s, you first have to understand what happened in the 150 years before that, like to understand that the difference between the two. And you do that in your book. You spend a lot of time walking through the century and a half of how Americans thought about defense and security before that. So what did this idea of security look like before, the late 1930s?
Yeah. So I take an idea that some scholars have played around with, but nobody, as far as I can tell, if you know, then, now's the time. Actually, now's not the time. A year and a half ago was the time to tell me. If you know of any literature that I missed, keep it to yourself. Don't tell.
Yeah.
Don't tell your listeners. Maybe send me an email and then I'll delete it. But as far as I can tell, there's an idea that some scholars have thrown out there. Fred Logevall and Campbell Craig played around with it in their book, America's Cold War. But the idea is free security. And it's this idea that Americans could take their security for granted. They could take their basic security for granted from the end of the War of 1812 up until some point in the 20th century. And this is where some disagreement comes in. When did the U.S. lose its free security? I think some sort of hardcore IR realists say the U.S. never really lost its free security. But on the whole, I think most people agree it's sometime around the World War II, early Cold War period. And so what I wanted to do was actually investigate, what does free security mean? What does it mean when you can take your security for granted? I won't bore your listeners with all the details, but I'm quite proud of that first chapter by looking in at how Americans between 1815 and the early 20th century thought about their place in the world, thought about their security, what it meant to be under threat or meet the threats that might arise. And on the whole, most Americans didn't really see any overseas threats during that period. And I'm surprised that there hasn't been more written about it. It is a unique condition in geopolitics in the modern world. I can't think of another, like if you think of all the peer competitors for the US in that period, you think of Japan, Germany, Britain, France, Russia, China. I mean, they all, and as well as many, many other countries, they all were attacked. All but Britain were invaded. Most of them had their way of life or their system of government overthrown or imposed by outsiders. And the US escaped all that. It's a really unique condition. And I make the argument in the book that this sort of conditioned how Americans viewed the world, not just through that period, but in the period after. It very heavily influenced how Americans viewed threats in the wider world. And that legacy of free security is what FDR and other internationalists had to overcome in convincing Americans to get involved in the world crisis in the late 1930s.
Yeah, as you noted, it definitely comes across in the early chapters about the uniqueness of the position of the United States. Friendly and or extremely weak neighbors, comparatively speaking, in the North and the South, the vast oceans on either side of us that stop large invading armies from coming over after 1815. You do mention, though, that Woodrow Wilson starts to make an attempt at this notion of national security, but doesn't go to the lengths that FDR does. So walk us through what he was doing in the World War I period.
Yeah, so I see the Wilsonian period or the Wilson period as one of false starts towards national security. He also starts to build a progressive state that then the New Deal surpasses. And I see the two as linked, thinking about social security and national security, or thinking about socioeconomic security and then security against foreign threats as intertwined. And that's really what the main contribution of the book is. And Wilson develops both of those lines, domestically in terms of socioeconomic security and internationally in terms of security against foreign threats, but doesn't take them as far as Franklin Roosevelt. Now, part of that is just because the context of geopolitics in the World War I period is different from what it would be in the 1940s. So The U.S. joins the war. The war is over in 1918. The U.S. makes a huge contribution to the Allied victory. And after that, then Americans look around and they say, and they do say, I mean, I have lots of evidence and I could have had an entire book of these quotes, but I only chose a few of them. But Americans say, wow, there's nothing out there now. Like there's no reason for us to be at all even nervous, let alone scared. And so the U.S. doesn't make a security guarantee to the French. It doesn't join the League of Nations. It just really wants to take a step back. And only a country that feels really secure would be able to do that. So the geopolitical context is different. But also Wilson never really makes that case about self-defense. He kind of builds this whole apparatus that would have been perfect for a president to come in and say, our security is at risk, is under threat, and we need to do something about it. But instead, when he asks Congress for a declaration of war, he actually goes to Capitol Hill and says, will you declare war? And he doesn't tell Congress or the American people that we're under threat. He doesn't say it's a war of self-defense. He says it's a war for the good of humanity. It's to make the world safe for democracy. And making the world safe for democracy would be a good thing, but it would also make the world safe for the world's biggest democracy, the U.S. So there is a kind of foreign policy calculation there. It's not pure idealism or humanitarianism. But he doesn't say, if we don't go to war, then we're going to be attacked or we're going to be in big trouble. And Roosevelt does that. Roosevelt, in the late 30s and early 40s, over and over and over again, he says, if we don't stop them in Europe, if we don't stop them in China, then the next thing you know, they're going to be at our shores. So this is in our self-interest. Wilson never made that self-interest argument explicitly. And so that's why I think of him as a kind of false start, but he did raise a lot of the issues that then Franklin Roosevelt would build on and complete.
Yeah. And before we get to the notion of what this new national security meant and what Roosevelt was talking about and other internationalists of the 1930s were talking about when they said national security, you also mentioned the connection between Wilson and his progressive policies that then FDR takes even further with the New Deal. You make the argument that this notion of national security wouldn't really have been possible without the New Deal and without that domestic notion of security that was kind of ingrained in the New Deal and the New Deal policies, and especially things like Social Security. So why is that? How are you making that argument?
I make it in two ways. One is that the idea of Social Security provides the Roosevelt administration and FDR with a conceptual and an ideological framework for not just reacting to economic problems at home, but foreign problems abroad. And that is the government's basic responsibility to its citizens to protect them against threats and to ensure their security. And those threats could be old age or unemployment or bank failures or hunger, or you can't buy a home or whatever. Or they could be Germany or Japan. I mean, that sounds glib, but it really did come down to that at its most fundamental level. And that seems obvious to us today, but it was revolutionary at the time. Revolutionary might be putting it too strong, but it was very new. And it was a new social contract that Roosevelt was proposing to the American people. It's a social contract that Wilson for sure started to develop, but again, he didn't follow through and take it as far as FDR would. So liberalism, traditionally in the 19th century into the 20th century to this day, the baseline for liberalism is about the protection of the individual. And in the 19th century, well into the 20th century, liberals thought that the main threat to their individual liberty was the state. Mm-hmm. So liberalism was highly anti-statist. And what Roosevelt did, again, not from scratch, but building on earlier ideas that the progressives and Wilson had, but what Roosevelt did was say, actually, the biggest threat to individual liberty is not the state, but private industry, private capital, foreign governments who are raising these mass totalitarian ideologies and armies and that kind of thing. And actually the state, the liberal state, is the best guarantor of individual liberty in the United States. So that reframing of the social contract that liberalism provides, that's at the heart of his domestic reforms. That's at the heart of the New Deal. That's at the heart of Social Security, but it's also at the heart of national security. We are here to protect you because we're the only force that's going to be able to protect you in this really complicated, interconnected, interdependent modern world. So that's the first way that I see it. The second way that I see Social Security providing the baseline for national security, it's a source of ideas for reacting to the world. So even if there was, let's play a counterfactual, Roosevelt dies in 1936, 1937, and he's not president when the world crisis really heats up from that period on. Even if you had another really internationalist president who wanted to take the U.S. into, maybe not into war, but certainly wanted to aid the Allies and resist the Germans and Japanese, he very well may have taken a different course. He may not have come up with the same kind of response that Roosevelt did, because maybe he wouldn't be drawing on the ideas of the New Deal. He wouldn't be drawing on the ideas of New Deal liberalism and this new social contract. And that's where national security really is born. Of course, that president might have been someone like Herbert Hoover and didn't want to get involved at all. So having FDR as president in the late 30s, drawing on those ideas of the New Deal, it's not inevitable at all. I'm not saying you said it was, but it's not inevitable. It really does depend on that person, the people around him, and how they used ideas of domestic, social, economic security and applied them in a conceptual way to foreign policy.
Yeah, it's definitely tied to that very recent personal experience of going through the New Deal and installing these new programs.
Right.
So you talk about that 1937 is when the major shift begins to happen, and Roosevelt starts talking about this notion of national security. And you mentioned the quarantine speech in Chicago in 1937, which is coincidentally he's at a New Deal, what was it, a bridge opening?
Yeah, a bridge in Chicago. It's a PWA built bridge that was very important to the people of Chicago. It basically connects the northern and southern halves of what's now Lakeshore Drive together.
There's the very apparent connection, looking back as a historian, between the New Deal domestic policies and then this new thing of national security. So what was this idea that Roosevelt was talking about and the internationalists were talking about? What was national security in their minds, and how did it fundamentally differ from this notion of free security that we had basically been thinking of since the War of 1815 or 1812?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's at the heart of the book. So before the late 1930s, American self-defense was very traditional and it was pretty universal, as in most states viewed their self-defense in this way. And it was the protection of their territorial sovereignty, of their physical safety. So for something to be a matter of national self-defense, it meant repelling an attack or a plausible attack that was maybe about to come on your territory, on your people, in your country, that kind of thing. And what national security is, and this is why it was so revolutionary, is that it is about chain reaction threats that could be global, that maybe it's not immediately plausible that those chain reaction threats could reach the shores of the United States, but they might one day, because the world is complicated, the world is interconnected. So it is about physical safety in that sense. It still is about protecting what later becomes homeland security. So national security is about protecting against physical danger to territorial sovereignty, but it's also about protecting, and this is crucial, it's about protecting a way of life, the American way of life, which FDR is the first president to talk about national security regularly. The American way of life is another phrase that is coined in this period. And I think that's not a coincidence. There are all sorts of ways of thinking about America's place in the world: the American dream, America first, the American way of life, national security. They come from this period because I think in this incredibly unstable time of economic crisis, the First World War, the Second World War, that Americans are asking themselves, who are we and who are we in the world? And some of the answers are all about defining who Americans are and what they stand for in the world. So national security is not just about protecting against physical threat, it's about protecting a way of life in the world, because the world is so interdependent that the United States cannot remain, as FDR put it in a famous speech in June of 1940 at the University of Virginia, where I'm going to be moving myself. He says the United States cannot remain a lone island of democracy in a world ruled by force. And that kind of turned everything on its head, because up until then, Americans loved being the lone island of democracy. They loved being that example of Democrats, small d Democrats, in a world of tyrants and dictators and kings and queens and emperors. They were the democratic exception. And so Roosevelt's saying that's no longer possible. And so even if, because this was his response to people who said, look, people like Herbert Hoover or Charles Lindbergh or others who said, look, the Germans aren't going to attack us. Japanese aren't going to attack us. And he would say, well, they might one day, but right now it doesn't really matter because it's not about protecting California or New York that is the urgent matter. What really, really is important is that we protect this democratic capitalist way of life in the world, because if it's snuffed out everywhere else, we're not going to be able to sustain it at home.
Right. And it's interesting, too, when you think about the early stages of globalization in the early 20th century and how those things came together with what was going on in Europe with the New Deal to sort of create this perfect storm of situations where you can start to have that shift in thinking. And you talk a lot about Roosevelt in the book, but there's also some other characters in there. And I'm not ashamed to say that my favorite movie of all time is Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life.
Absolutely.
It's just, it gets me every single time in the last scene. But
You're
Frank
doing it
Capra,
now. You're getting choked up now.
I know, I can just thinking about George and all the people coming in and giving it, spoiler alert. But anyways, you talk about Capra and he comes up a bit in the second half of the book, but you also include some other players that are outside of traditional policymaking circles. So why is Capra so important to your book and this argument? And what other interesting figures play a part in, or maybe were left out of, the creation of national security?
Yeah. So you're right about It's a Wonderful Life. And you're right about Capra's role in the book. He's a really important figure. And I never expected that when I started the book. I mean, Capra is in the book more than Dean Acheson is. And so who writes a book about American national security and how it's born in the 30s and 40s? And Capra is in the index a lot more than Dean Acheson.
Yeah.
And it's not just Acheson. There are all sorts of figures. Okay. So Capra is important. I look at him, he appears from time to time through the book, but I look at him at two important moments. One is the Why We Fight series of films that he makes just after the U.S. joins World War II. The first one is in 1942, and then he makes 6 other films after that. And then I begin chapter 7 by looking at It's a Wonderful Life. And I use Capra partly because I'm a Capra fan as well. And that's just fun and it's unexpected, but partly
Right. Yeah.
also, I mean, more substantially or substantively, it's because he was such an important filmmaker. And by being a filmmaker at that time, as you could argue now, maybe less so now, he is creating a sense of identity, a kind of ideology for, again, what it means to be an American in this highly unstable world. And he's thinking, I mean, his movies are very self-consciously answering those questions. Most specifically in the propaganda films he makes in Why We Fight, but also in It's a Wonderful Life, as well as all his wonderful movies of the 1930s. And Capra was thinking about what FDR was calling national security, what America's role in the world was. What does it mean to be under threat? What does it mean to be at risk in this interdependent world? What does globalization mean? Although he didn't use the word globalization. And so Capra was this not only a really fun, but a perfect vehicle to look at these changing ideas. I started with Capra, though, and I started thinking about him for this national security book because of the Why We Fight films, when George Marshall asked Capra to come to Washington after the U.S. joins the war and says, look, I need someone to explain to GIs exactly why they're going to be fighting in the world. That's why the series is called Why We Fight. George Marshall says, I want you to tell our men in uniform what they're fighting for, why they're fighting. Now, that's a familiar story, but it's always kind of bugged me because I thought it's a strange thing that George Marshall would think that there was a need for American soldiers to be told why they're fighting. No other country that was involved in World War II really needed to be, especially on the Allied side that were attacked. They, the Chinese and the Russians and the British and the French, they didn't need to be told why they were fighting. But even after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Marshall was really worried that a lot of American soldiers just wouldn't get it and they wouldn't know. And he says something to, it's in the book, but he says something to Capra like, I want you to explain to an Iowa farmer when Iowa's not about to be attacked. I want you to explain to an Iowa farmer why he needs to go and risk his life halfway around the world. And that got me thinking about Capra. It got me thinking about filmmakers and what filmmakers do to explain the stakes of what it means to be an American in this increasingly complicated world. Other people I look at are the photojournalist Margaret Burke-White, Henry Luce, who of course is going to be familiar to a lot of your listeners. I look at a lot of African-American intellectuals and what they thought of national security, not only the people, someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, but also Rayford Logan and Ralph Bunche, Mary McLeod Bethune, and others. Thomas Hart Benton, the painter, makes a briefer appearance than those other people. But I wanted this book not just to be about high policy, because at the end of the day, national security it's part of political culture. It's part of national ideology. And that's not just something that's sort of, announced by a Secretary of State or a president.
Right. Yeah.
Through culture.
Yeah. And when you mentioned Marshall again, too, it was very interesting seeing the New Deal connections that he had as well, and the way that he was in many ways simpatico with his views and with Roosevelt's views on this new thing, national security, and its correlation to the New Deal.
That's
I
right.
found that very interesting and something I hadn't seen before.
I didn't know about it before I did this book.
Yeah. And so the war ends, and like following World War I, the United States is in a enviable position as far as strength and power go. And so once again, it calls in this question, like, do we need this national security viewpoint? So there was no guarantee that this was going to become something that we still have with us today following 1945. So what happened in the years immediately following World War II to make this become entrenched and continue on in American foreign policy and just American way of thinking?
Yeah, during the war, as early as 1943, the War Department starts planning for demobilization. That's pretty...
Yeah.
I kind of knew that, but I hadn't really thought about it until I started reading the secondary literature on it, doing some research up in College Park at the National Archives. There was a lot of detailed planning as early as 1943 and a lot more planning in 1944 about demobilizing the Army. That's the American tradition. Fight a war, ramp up the military, especially the Army, as fast as possible, make it big, make it into this lethal machine. And then when the war's over, demobilize it. Again, that's only a country that feels very secure can do that. And that's what they were planning to do at the end of World War II. It's what they did do. The military demobilizes really, really rapidly. Then, of course, there's the origins of the Cold War. The Soviets appear to be more threatening. And what's really important is that the Soviet model seems to fit especially the Nazi Germany model, but the general fascist, expansionist, militarist model of an ideological enemy that is bent on conquest. And even though it's far away, it's threatening a way of life just as much as the Nazis were. It could one day reach American shores and so on and so forth. So it is a national security threat, as national security is now thought of. I think without the Soviet threat, or at least what they saw as the Soviet threat at the time, the national security revolution might have fizzled out. Who knows?
Yeah.
But what happens is, unlike after World War I, FDR has created this architecture, ironically, to work with the Soviets, but it's easily adapted to work against the Soviets. So FDR has created this whole architecture. He dies in the spring of 45, of course. But then when there's a new threat that seems to come on the horizon, everything snaps back into place right away. And so there is a group of historians who have argued that national security is born in the early Cold War period, in 1947, if we're to pick a date, maybe 46. And it's that Soviet threat that creates national security. I'm saying that's kind of the completion of the story. That's the end point where it all falls into place. It crystallizes. And it crystallizes because Truman just simply puts into action everything, all these ideas and concepts, and even some of the architecture that FDR had put in place.
Yeah. And you take the book all the way up to today at the end and talking about how we're still living with the creation from the late 1930s. So how do you see that? And you also talk about the need for change. What are some of the notions and ideas that you put in the book about how to do that?
So I argue in the book, in the epilogue, that national security falls into place in 1947. That's when it's set, and it doesn't change after that. Now, Americans and others have argued bitterly over specific national security policies, but the basic way of assessing threat in terms of a mix of physical danger, but also a danger to a way of life, that has remained unchanged until very recently. And I think historians 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years from now are going to be writing about the Trump presidency for all sorts of reasons, because it's an incredibly, whether you're a fan of Trump or you're not a fan, it's a very consequential presidency.
Yeah.
And one of the ways in which I think it's going to be very consequential is in this basic thinking about national security. And I think that Trump is, and again, this is not a criticism necessarily, because I think a lot of it is deliberate, but he's undoing a lot of the aspects of the FDR national security revolution. I mean, it's not a coincidence that part of Trump's message is America First, which, of course, was the title of the America First Committee in 1940-41. And Trump talks a lot, and so does J.D. Vance, so do a lot of people around him, Steve Bannon. They talk a lot about distance in a way that people haven't for a long time. Again, that's not a criticism, and perhaps they're correct. But what interests me is that that's cutting up, because, the whole point of the FDR national security revolution is that distance doesn't matter.
Right. It shortens the distance. Yeah.
Right. And now people are thinking, I mean, Trump has said this about Ukraine. He said this about Syria. He said this about all sorts of places. Look, it's 8,000 miles away. It's 6,000 miles away. Why should we care? On the other hand, Trump is also following in the footsteps of a lot of previous national security policies. He's not the first president to impose tariffs for national security reasons. A lot of presidents have used national security to justify interventions and wars, sure, but also all sorts of things that clearly aren't about military affairs or foreign policy. So he fits in with that. And just what's happened in the last few days with Iran, that absolutely fits in with previous national security policies. So I think we're going to need some distance, some historians' distance, to come to terms with what's happening now in terms of the history of national security as an idea, as a policy, as a threat perception. I think we are going to need some distance because there's a lot here to grapple with. And of course, there's a lot still to come because Trump is only in the first 6 months of his presidency.
Yeah. And we saw how, things snapped back after the first administration.
Right.
Will it snap back again if there's a Democrat elected in 2028 or a more internationalist in the Oval Office? That remains to be seen. Well, listen, Andrew, this was great. And thanks a lot for joining us and talking about your new book.
Thanks, Kelly. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks again to Andrew for his time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.